You can design the solar panel to absorb parts of the spectrum, let's say on a greenhouse, where you let in the parts of the spectrum that the plants need, and then you absorb the rest of the solar spectrum. And that part of the solar spectrum is essentially harvested to create electricity for the greenhouse to operate.
This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. Efficiency is important in modern and future electronic devices. Material scientists and engineers are working to develop and advance materials and devices that harvest energy from light, resulting in more efficient solar cell technologies. We're joined by Aram Amassian, professor in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering at North Carolina State University, where his research group is working with electronic, optoelectronic, and photovoltaic materials and devices, including perovskite solar cells. Professor Amassian, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, Nate.
Your lab deals with a lot of materials, and there's a couple kinds that specifically I want to ask you about to start things off and kind of, make the concepts of them understandable for people. And that's photovoltaic materials and optoelectronic materials. Can you kind of broadly describe what we're talking about there?
So photovoltaic materials, broadly speaking, are materials that convert light into electricity. So they're very important materials from a societal perspective. We think about the climate change, for example. We think about renewable energy. So photovoltaic materials are an important part of the energy mix. We think about solar panels today. That's kind of first generation photovoltaic technology, primarily based on wafers. Second generation photovoltaic technology is based on thin film. So less material utilization, the ability to have flexible photovoltaics, and kind of emerging materials coming into that as well. We'll talk about some of those emerging materials like perovskites and organics and so on. And then you have third generation technologies, is when you kind of mix and match those technologies together to try to push the efficiency well beyond what is possible with a single material, right, into kind of beyond the Shockley-Queisser limit in terms of efficiencies. And that's kind of a frontier of photovoltaics research. Now, on the flip side of this, you can also take a lot of these materials or other materials, and you can also use them differently. Instead of converting light into electricity, you can inject electricity and convert it into light, right? And so now we're talking about light emitting devices like LEDs used in the display that our audience is probably watching, or they might be using a smartphone to listen, that the display on that smartphone is using LEDs. They might be, if a teacher might be using a laser pointer that's using optoelectronic technology that's converting the battery power in that laser pointer into a laser light source, right? So those are a couple of examples that essentially are based on this type of material and technology.
So you mentioned perovskites there. That's the next area we need to explore. What are perovskites and why are they of interest for researchers?
Right. So perovskites have been around for a very, very long time. In fact, they were discovered in the 19th centuries, but they've come in many different flavors because actually perovskite is a general formula. It's an ABX3 formula. The most famous solar cell that's kind of part of this renaissance in perovskites for renewable energy is actually based on what's called a hybrid perovskite based on lead as the metal in that material. And so in the B position. And so it turns out that in order to stabilize this perovskite, lead is quite large, and you need to have the right size atoms in order to stabilize it. And back in the day, in the 1970s, a scientist by the name of Dieter Weber, University of Stuttgart, replaced the cesium, which is the largest monovalent cation that you could have in the A site. He replaced it with essentially a synthetic cation, right? A synthetic cation, an organic cation, which is a trimethyl ammonium ion. And that created the first hybrid perovskite. Now, it wasn't explored for decades. The first exploration of this material was actually by I'm at NC State. Next door, very, very close by at Duke University is one of the first people who kind of really explored it for technology applications. David Mitzi, he studied it for transistors, for LEDs. And then years later, it was in 2006, 2009 were the first studies in solar. And then it kind of exploded from there. And it was a meteoric rise to now reaching 26% in a single junction device. So it's been really remarkable. What makes it really exciting is the fact that you have these synthetic cations. That's one of the things that makes it really exciting. So for people who are into material discovery, it opens up a whole universe of possibilities, almost an infinite possibility. And because you can also not just have one replacement, you can have multiple A-site cations, you can have multiple B-site metals, and you can have, of course, the halide and the X-site to really tune the material properties. Now, not only is it exciting to try these, to tune the band gap of the materials, but it's also an imperative. Third generation solar technology is about creating what's called multi-junction solar cells tandems, where you're trying to harvest different parts of the solar spectrum in order to create a much higher efficiency solar panel. In order to do that, you have to now fine-tune the band gap of the perovskite material. You do that by engineering the composition. And once you do that, you need to create an alloy or a compound that is really stable. And so it is imperative for materials science engineers to fine-tune the composition of the A site, the B site, and the X site, not only to have the right properties, but to have a material that's extremely stable at temperature, under illumination, under voltage, and for decades. And so that kind of is the landscape, I would say, at a high level.
And that instability is kind of one of the issues with the current generation of perovskite solar cells, right?
That's right. And one of the things that my group and other groups around the world have found that's fascinating is the fact that perovskites are ionic semiconductors, which means that the components are forming kind of a ceramic, and in so doing, the defects are formed within and the components within the perovskite material are charged. And so under voltage, for example, you will have migration of these charged ions towards the opposite electrode. You will also have phenomena like electrochemistry happening. And so those are complicated phenomena that you do not think of in the context of silicon, for example. So now we have to kind of develop the scientific understanding and engineering solutions to this. But on the opposite side of this problem is an opportunity, which is the fact that these materials are ionic, means that they can also be solution processable with polar solvents. So you can actually manufacture these materials using liquid-based solutions in ambient conditions. So we can come back to that point later, but that is one of the appeals of this technology. Once we can harness it and control it, it is amenable to potentially very, very low cost, large area manufacturing, which is actually one of the things that excites technologists and the markets considerably.
The study that brought your work to my attention is involving layered hybrid perovskites. Can you talk a little bit about that and how they might be useful?
If hybrid perovskites, the ABX3 structure was not complicated enough, let's throw in another cation. And this one is a little bit larger. So the ABX3 structure forms a nice cube or a tetragonal structure, for example, for simplicity. And now imagine that we throw in a larger cation molecule, A site, like similar to the A site, but it's too large to fit in. And so what that does, it kind of breaks the structure up into slabs. So where you have slabs of the perovskite, and then they're separated by layers of this cation, which decorates the surface of these slabs. And you have alternating layers of these metal halide perovskite slabs. What's interesting is that within the confine of these slabs, you have the ability to move charges, and so on. And the cation that's kind of decorating them is providing something of what's called a confinement that's on a very, very small scale, a nanometer scale, so much so that the electrons in that material experience quantum confinement. And that is actually very exciting from the perspective of applications like displays and LEDs and lasers. And so that's on the optoelectronic side, right? So there's a lot of interest in harnessing layered perovskites for the purpose of being able to inject charge in them, and in a very controlled manner, and controlling also the size of these confined, we call them quantum wells, essentially control the emission color and control how the energy moves inside the material. And one of the discoveries that we made in that study is around the topic of how exactly these layered hybrid perovskites form. Now, the interesting thing is that these layered hybrid perovskites also work very effectively in solar cell applications, as long as you can get those slabs to form vertically, right? Because in a solar panel, you have a structure where you have two electrodes at the top and the bottom, and those are your current collectors. So as long as the slabs are vertical, the charges can move very, very quickly up and down towards the current collectors, and the cation layers are not blocking the charge collection. And it turns out that in that context, layered perovskites also have more stable structure, and they seem to actually address some of the stability concerns that traditional perovskites have, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of interest for them also in the photovoltaic arena, in addition to the optoelectronic arena, which is light emission.
Is it hard getting them to grow vertically? Like, is that part of the trick, getting it to what direction and controlling how the wells form?
That's a good question. It has been one of the kind of the challenges to get them to grow vertically. And I think that over the last few years, the community has come to understand that they don't grow from the bottom up. They grow from the top down. And so, and that's kind of been one of the contributions of our study, which is to show how essentially you have this initially a seed layer that forms at the very top that initiates the formation of all of these quantum wells, whether they form horizontally or vertically, the sequence in which they form. I would say that there is some understanding in how that happens, but there isn't a comprehensive picture yet of exactly how to control that orientation. So there's still some work to be done in that sense.
One of the other projects you worked on, and you sort of mentioned earlier, there being organic solar cells. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yes. So organic solar cells essentially have no inorganic components like lead. Essentially, they don't use other components from the periodic table. They're typically using polymers, so mostly carbon-based, so hydrocarbons that sometimes will include sulfur and oxygen and nitrogen and fluorine. So lighter elements. These are all essentially synthesized materials, and they're also solution processed. And this is a technology that has evolved over the last few decades to get to a point where the efficiency has reached 20%. And it's one of the key characteristics of this technology, I would say, is that you can very nicely control the color spectrum of absorption, and much better than most other materials. And so to give you an example, if you think about the dyes on my shirt or yours or other clothes and so on, those are made with organic molecules, right? And you can really pick and choose which color you want to have. And that's not very dissimilar from how an organic solar cell is made. You can have, so you can have like a whole color palette. You can now think about designing an organic solar cell that has a color palette. So if you think about, for example, applications like agriculture, you can design the solar panel to absorb parts of the spectrum where, let's say on a greenhouse, where you let in the parts of the spectrum that the plants need, for example, lettuce or tomato, and then you absorb the rest of the solar spectrum that are not needed by photosynthesis, for example. Mm-hmm. And that part of the solar spectrum is essentially harvested to create electricity for the greenhouse to operate. Right. So now you have this synergy and symbiosis between the greenhouse and whatever is growing inside the greenhouse. So energy is kind of used much more efficiently. And that would not be possible with a technology like perovskites, which is a much kind of more broadband absorber. It's a very, very good absorber, excellent absorber. Silicon also, as we know, is just going to absorb everything, right? And so, but that doesn't mean that now you're going to have, you're going to solve all of the world's energy needs, but you're going to be able to provide local energy subsystem and local energy solutions, for example, for agriculture. And you could also provide this solution for building integration, so into Windows. I think that is also a very, very effective way organic solar cells can be used. In addition to kind of having an aesthetic value or aesthetic angle where you can kind of pick and choose the colors that you want it to have. So I think that's kind of where I see organic photovoltaics playing, emerging as an interesting technology in our society.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot back to the layered hybrid perovskite slightly for this question, because I'm thinking about kind of the next steps and the path to commercialization. So like now that you know that you can make the quantum wells and you can tune these in a way to make them more efficient, what are kind of the steps that have to happen before that can be like a commercial application that is just in any solar cell technology?
To take that question it's kind of a little bit more broadly, there are kind of standard steps any technology has to go through towards commercialization. I think there are upscaling and device integration, device validation questions, moving up technology readiness level that has to happen as well. I think, from the perspective of photovoltaics, we are particularly interested in enabling certain aspects of commercialization. So we are, for instance, kind of our next project in this area is looking at using artificial intelligence-based systems to translate the lab scale knowledge to more upscaled large area fabrication in conditions that resemble manufacturing environments. So manufacturing environments in the context of hybrid perovskites, if we think about them, this technology is low-cost manufacturing in the presence of some humidity and oxygen in the manufacturing environment, and that would considerably reduce the cost of manufacturing compared to vacuum deposition. And so in that context, using some level of automation, some level of artificial intelligence with inline characterization to essentially understand and map and understand what are the ways in which to translate the best practices of formulation, process structure, property relationships in a lab process over to a more scalable pilot scale fabrication process. And then can we reduce that gap? So typically, if we think about how lab-based technology gets transferred to pilot scale or manufacturing technology, there is a significant gap where several years are spent developing lab technology. Then when it's transferred to the next scale, we realize that the work that was done in the lab was done on a different tool, and perhaps we have to restart everything, right? So what we're trying to do here is really bridge that gap and integrate those efforts and see how we can learn to reduce that time, but without necessarily circumventing knowledge development. I think that's very, very important to us, that we're not just doing brute force optimization, but we're also developing scientific understanding. And in this case, the fundamental knowledge we're interested in is processing science, manufacturing science.
The last question I had set aside for you today is thinking about the future. What makes you optimistic about the future and the work you have in the next few years?
I did this work over the last couple of years in my laboratory, thinking about ways in which I could prove to myself how we could utilize artificial intelligence, automation, to move forward scientific inquiry. And I have to say that, I come from a background where we use deep scientific inquiry to kind of do our scientific, kind of deep analytical approaches to do scientific inquiry. And over the last few years, I've kind of tried to see whether there's an opportunity to use these new methods and see for myself if we can come up with new scientific understanding, and how much can we not just optimize things faster, but can we develop knowledge faster, right? And we have not published the work yet, but I have convinced myself that it is possible. So that's something I'm very keen to pursue further and try to demonstrate to the community, hopefully some constructive ways in which we can do it. Because I think that if we can show and develop the next generation of scientists how we might accelerate the path to solving important problems, then it's a win-win for everybody and for our disciplines to kind of remain relevant, right? And the other thing is that finding ways to do this within the context of our disciplines, as I kind of alluding to it, and with our students, as opposed to with just artificial intelligence telling us. So, we're trying to think about ways of creating human AI machine interactions that are empowering to the student, empowering to the researcher, as opposed to interactions that take away value from the scientific and educational and academic experience or pedagogical experience that we want to create for our students. And I think that's kind of a fine balance. There's still a lot of experimentation to be done there. But I think if we can create the right tools, then potentially we can harness those methods and create value, scientific, engineering, and technological societal value, in the next few years.
Special thanks to Aram Amassian. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Podker. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts, and if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.